Okay, perfect. So, welcome everybody. Today is the uh, first meeting of our seminar series organized by the Italian Society on History of Science, and we are more than happy to introduce the third series after the other two seasons that were very successful. Also, this year we are going to have four different seminars with a wide range of topics touched upon in these seminars. And today, as you can see, we're going to start with Giacomo Simoncelli, who will talk about influenza preparedness, so the global governance of pandemic influenza from the Spanish flu to contemporary age, that is to COVID-19, which is not actually an influenza, but still it is a virus, so it's quite connected. Giacomo is a PhD student at Sapienza University of Rome. Now is in the process of writing his final essay. Actually, is going to have his viva in a couple of months, actually. So he's going to be a PhD soon. He has already submitted or published several essays in international context, and that is in books and journals. And all these efforts are going to be out in the next few months, we hope. And after being a graduate in history at the University of Siena, he joined the PhD school in history at Sapienza University of Rome, and now is towards the end of the viva. Um, as we can see, his main concern is about the viral networks that were prepared during the 20th century, that were set up during the 20th century, and especially the idea of how, well, the Cold War perspective on the influenza surveillance network. But he's going to discuss this in detail during the seminar. Also, I will. I I give you a notice, an early notice of the next seminar, which is going to be on May the 5th, same time, same place, and that is the same link. And we are going to host Brenda McWhorter from University of Virginia, and she's going to discuss astral science at the Gonzaga court in the 16th century. So it's going to be quite a different topic, but this is actually one of the main reasons of this seminar series, that is to approach history of science with a wider range of topics and methods and perspective as possible in order to show how diverse this field could be and how enjoyable actually this and fun actually this field of research can be, given this diversity, this extreme biodiversity in our research field. So, thank you, Giacomo, for being here. We're going to have 45 minutes talk. And after that, we're going to have discussion, 45 minutes discussion. So we're going to close at 6 o'clock sharp. And Giacomo, I'm going to tell you when there are 5 minutes left. And so now the floor is yours. And thank you again, everybody, for being here. And talk later. So, Giacomo, the floor is yours.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for this opportunity of presenting you these few slides on influenza preparedness. I wanted to present this during this seminar, this period, this 20th century preparedness against the pandemic, the possible threat of a pandemic, because I think that's interesting to understand how preparedness changed during the last century. First of all, influenza preparedness. We all know what influenza is, more or less. As Mauro has already highlighted, when we talk about COVID-19, it's something different from influenza viruses A and B, especially what I've studied the last 3 years. But of course, well, to simplify it, when we have cough, when we sneeze, when we have fever, we call it influenza. So everybody knows what influenza is. Preparedness is something a little bit different, a little bit. It's not as easy as influenza to describe, but maybe you have already read it in my abstract, in the abstract for this seminar, that preparedness can be considered as a state of continuous readiness. It means readiness to identify a possible outbreak of a disease and then to counter the disease itself, its effects, its spread. So it's something related to public authorities, it's something related to the measures that public authorities can implement to counter the issue, the threat of a disease or a pandemic. Um, so when we talk about influenza preparedness, and specifically when we talk about influenza, a disease that can spread very quickly worldwide, we have to deal with a global governance. We have to deal with global measures to counter the disease. So it means also that we have to deal with international relations framework. So it doesn't, no. Uh, it doesn't change the slide. Sorry, I don't know why. It- no, why? Sorry, this technical issue. I don't know why it doesn't change the slide. Uh,
Uh, Maybe you have to select the correct window.
yeah, I'm on it, I think.
Maybe try to unshare and share again, because maybe
Okay.
like if you have many windows open, I don't know.
Uh, let's try with this. No. Uh, wait, sorry for this.
It's okay, quite common problem. Something that
I don't
happens
know
very
why.
much, very often.
Let's try. Oh, okay. You see it, right?
Yeah, it
Different
works.
slide.
Yeah, it works.
Move further.
Yeah,
Is
it
it
Yeah,
works.
okay?
Good.
perfect. It
Okay.
works. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was saying two introductory slides about what I'm going to tell you, what I'm going to talk about. As I said, when we talk about global governance dealing with health issues, we talk in a way of international health. We talk of an international framework regarding health issues. But when we talk about international health, well, at least in specialized literature, we talk about a specific concept. We talk about the creation of, well, the development of international cooperation on, on health issues promoted by governments, and also the creation of permanent bodies to help these health issues. So it's something specific. It's not the same thing as saying global health, even though, of course, there are connections, of course, there are similarities, but it's something different. Global health is something that um, well, it has been is a concept that has been developed during the last maybe 40 years, 30 years, and it involves also non-governmental organization and so on. To cut it short, usually when we talk about international health, we talk about this framework in which the main actors are governmental actors, in a way, institutes connected to public authorities, and also these international, these usually multilateral agencies that deal with health issues. So I'm going to discuss about these bodies, about especially the Office International d'Hygiène Publique, the League of Nations Health Organization, the WHO. So addressing the influenza issue through the sources and the perspective coming from these bodies. The other part of this introduction regards what I mean when I talk about governance. Governance, as you can read in this quote, I think it's very, well, it's easy to understand. Governance settles politics, and I would say also foreign agendas regarding health issues and diplomacy into agreed patterns, providing for more consistency, transparency, and predictability. So when we talk about governance, we talk about the ground, well, based on laws and bodies that act in a predictable way, on which diplomats can promote the foreign agendas of their governments. So it means that we have to understand that governance is not something neutral in a way, I would say. It's not something that is neutral. It's something that is influenced by different actors with their own interests, with their own, as I said, foreign agendas and so on. But is it at least a sort of a ground that is recognized by every actors involved in this process of creating a governance, a system of measures against or to control a disease? Well, first of all, I've talked about international health. I've talked about international relations. Some hints about the origins of influenza before the 20th century. Well, I start from the 19th century. During that period, during that century, we know that almost all diseases were considered fevers in a way. I'm simplifying it, but it's something that can be considered as that. Every diseases were fevers, and from the end, from the 1780s, I would say that catarrhal fever, so this adjective that was added to fever, became what described the same symptoms, the same clinical manifestation as influenza today. As I said before, when you sneeze, when you have cough, when you have fever, and so on. But for sure, influenza at that time, but also until I would say maybe, the 1930s, was a protein disease, as Clifford Allbutt, an important physician, a British physician, described influenza in 1907. It's a protein disease because, of course, we all know that when you have fever, for instance, it's not it's not you are not obliged to have influenza in a way. Okay. So it was very difficult to describe influenza as an entity on its own, with specific manifestations, with specific features that can differ, can make influenza different from other diseases. Okay. Something began to change in the mid 19th century. At the time, an important British physician, as well as Allbutt, William Farr, managed to describe a sort of law of contagion for influenza using death rates. So he was a sort of precursor of influenza epidemiology. He wasn't the scholar who described the specific features of influenza, but at least he managed to create a sort of a table of influenza contagion to follow the path of seasonal contagion, and also to identify a possible outbreak and a possible pandemic thanks to different death rates. So using historical statistics from previous years, he managed to identify a sort of a law of contagion seasonally, and also to identify a possible event that could lead to a pandemic. It was very important because it was maybe the first time that mm, led to the idea that influenza was actually a contagious disease. But still, it wasn't a disease that was considered to be quarantinable, for instance. During that period, uh, there were, well, in 1851, just a few years after William Farr studied the 1948 and 49 epidemic of influenza in Great Britain, there was also the first International Sanitary Conference. So it was an important period. They were important years because it was not also the moment in which influenza was described in a more detailed way, but it was also the moment during which the first idea of an international governance was in a way planted in international relations. So those conferences dealt with diseases coming from outside Europe. Well, the specificity, the specific feature of these conferences was the fact that they were eminently European conferences gathering European powers to prevent the spread or the invasion, as some scholars during those years, during those conferences, defined that, to prevent the invasion of diseases coming from, especially from the Levant, the Middle East, India, China, and so on. So, oh, sorry. So they dealt with specifically with plague, which was not endemic in Europe anymore, more or less, with cholera, and later, especially when also the US were involved during the last years, during the last conferences of the 19th century, also yellow fever. Influenza was not among the diseases uh, treated, the diseases discussed at those conferences, at least until the 13th conference in 1926. Why? Because this is the first moment when we can devise a first form of preparedness. In fact, during those conferences, especially from the seventh conference on, so with the convention signed in 1892 and later, especially from with the convention signed in 1903, an international system of notification of the emergence, of the appearance of cases of diseases, of contagious diseases, was established. So this kind of preparedness was based on notification through telegraphic technology of the appearance of a disease. So countries, public authorities could implement health measures to deal with the diseases, to prevent the spread and the effects of the disease. Of course, it was what we could call a Westphalian system. The main pillar was the fact that this kind of system of notification should not um, interfere with domestic politics, and it was very important because it also proved the importance of the technological developments, advancements of the time for preventing the spread of diseases, or at least for managing the possible threats of pandemics. At the end of the century, something changed also regarding influenza. In fact, as I said, the first to study in a more detailed way influenza was for sure William Farr during the mid 19th century. But after his studies, in a way, influenza disappeared from the health discussions, health debates of the time until the end of the century. In fact, in 1889, a new pandemic broke out from Russia and spread worldwide. And it was also possible to follow its spread thanks to, as I said, technological advancements and especially telegraphic technologies. And it was also the first time that influenza was considered a global threat, a global menace, and also the first time that uh, um, led to the idea that it was important to define, to describe influenza as an entity on its own, with its own features. And then also to find, of course, its etiology. It was the period, it was the time during which germ theory was, well, established, was gaining legitimacy, and for sure, it was also the period during which all the microbiologists, the first microbiologists of the time, tried to identify the pathogens at the origin of influenza. Uh, Especially in 1892, it was, I'm not sure about the pronunciation because it was German. He is Richard Pfeiffer, I think that's the pronunciation. I'm not sure about that because it's not for sure Richard Pfeiffer as it was English. Uh, well, he was the first who claimed that he had found, he had identified the pathogen, the etiology of influenza in what was called the Pfeiffer's bacillus, or today the Haemophilus influenzae. It was a bacterium. It was not a virus, as we know today is influenza. So we know it was wrong, okay? But at the time, it was the main, I would say, theory about the origin of influenza. Although there were critics with their reasons about that. But it is also important to say that public authorities at the time didn't find any reason to add influenza to the list of diseases that were managed through the conventions signed at international conferences that I've told, that I've speak before. So it was the case that, of course, it was considered an important threat in a way, health threat, but it was also considered not a threat that could be quarantinable. Everybody knew that influenza could spread worldwide very quickly, and everybody knew in a way that it wasn't possible to to block the spread of the disease. So when a few years later the Spanish flu broke out, there were not so many measures to prevent that disaster. But it was also true that during those years, it became more and more evident that the Pfeiffer's bacillus was not at the origin of the disease. So when the Spanish flu ravaged across the world, it was also clear that they had no way to counter the disease and its effects. It was like a ground zero of the knowledge of influenza. Here you can, well, I decided to use this image because it's important, and that's the first time I will mention it. It is important to notice, to note the fact that this kind of preparedness, as I said, the capacity of identifying a possible outbreak and then implementing measures to counter the spread of the disease and its effects, was deeply linked to the war effort at the time. It was the first time that influenza became a real, an actual public threat because it was considered a threat to the war efforts at the end of the First World War. And you can read it in this image, in this US image. The spread of Spanish influenza menaces our war production, for instance. This concept of preparedness, although it was conceived, it was devised a little bit later in the 20th century, was in a way already present at the time, and it was, as I said, deeply influenced by the issue of war, the issue of the interest of the army in a way. So after the First World War, something again changed in a different way. It was important the fact that after the World War, a new permanent body was established inside the League of Nations framework. It was the League of Nations Health Organization, health sector. It was focused, especially from the creation of the Eastern Bureau in Singapore from 1925 on epidemiological surveillance. So it means well, all the instruments to follow the spread of diseases. And it was a sort of a revolution because I have said that Spanish flu was a sort of a ground zero about the influenza knowledge, so they knew nothing about its etiology. So it wasn't possible, it wasn't feasible to create a proper vaccine against the disease. The only way to, in a way, follow the spread of the disease and trying to prevent its effects, although it was clear that it wasn't possible to quarantine the disease, was following the spread itself, trying to implement measures like social distancing, masks, and so on. As I said, it couldn't prevent the spread of the disease eventually, but at least it gave time to manage it. So when the League of Nations implemented a better system for notifying the emergence of diseases and then the path fall of the diseases, it implemented a sort of epidemic intelligence, as it has been called by well, various scholars. I would like to cite just Anne Seeley. Maybe she's the most important scholar on the issue about the implementation of this epidemiological revolution, this epidemic intelligence. Well, it was an important revolution also for influenza, as I said, and it was also the terrain on which, for instance, appeared maybe for the first time a sort of competition of different European powers on the issue, on influenza. In fact, we know, well, I've read it on League of Nations sources, that to implement this system of epidemic intelligence, of course, they needed the assistance, they needed to rely on telegraphic stations. And for instance, in 1927, Germany offered its main station, the Neuen Station, to League of Nations freely, without any compensation, to present itself as an important power, of course, to enhance its prestige, but also to be involved in this new system, in this new governance of health issues after the First World War. We know that, of course, Germany lost the First World War and it was marginalized in various scientific institutions, not only at the beginning in the League of Nations, but for instance in the ICSU, yeah, and others. So Germany used an epidemic at the end of 1926, at the beginning of 1927, to promote its station, its technological advancements, without any compensation, as I said, from League of Nations, to enjoy this system with more legitimacy in a way. But of course, it wasn't the only station, it wasn't the only country interested in using, for instance, influenza to promote its role, its position in this international arena. Because, of course, there was also the US, And we know that during that time, the International Health Division of the Rockefeller was very important. We know also that the International Division had important connections with the governments. Um, and it was important to create, thanks to its stations, a sort of um, a system. I wouldn't say a global yet, but for sure an international system, especially focused on the Americas, to control and to prevent the spread of the disease, or at least to carry out important serological studies on the disease. Of course, there was still a problem, an important problem, the fact that during the 20s there was still no idea about the etiology of influenza. They could, for instance, register cases of the disease, but they could not identify a pathogen at the origin of the disease. As I said, the Rockefeller was very important for this international system that was a novelty in a way, but was also something that was that became a model later for the WHO, in my opinion. But it was also important because of the studies carried out on the etiology of influenza in connection with the other important institution of my historiographical reconstruction, the Medical Research Council in London. In 1933, the virologist working in London managed to isolate for the first time a virus, the virus of influenza. And during that decade, important studies were carried out jointly with New York, with the International Health Division, and led also to the the acknowledgement to the fact that of the fact that to deeply to actually understand influenza virology, it was necessary to have to rely on an international system of isolation and study of the virus. That was because it was well, it was acknowledged the fact that the viruses could change in their antigenic configuration, these proteins that are connected to the virus, to make it short. And it was the main issue when the creation of vaccines, the control of the disease, had to face. So at the time, even though there were different opinions, it was also clear that it was necessary to create this international system. So it was also necessary to promote international cooperative efforts to counter, to control the spread of the disease, to control the antigenic variation of the disease, and later also to manage the spread, as I said, and to create vaccines. The third International Congress on Microbiology was a pivotal moment because held in 1939, just one day later, the invasion of Poland from Nazi Germany. As I said, it was a pivotal moment because it was the first time that this need was acknowledged. I hope it can be read, the text here, more or less, okay? But okay, they decided at the time that it was necessary to create this plan that had to rely on a big international effort, or cooperative effort, to share strains, information, statistics, the epidemiology, of course, studies on influenza to actually control the spread of the disease. 30 minutes, I see, so I'm trying to make it quicker. Um, of course, there was the Second World War. After the Second World War, the new institution that appeared on this health arena was the WHO, as we know. The WHO, the Interim Commission, tasked Christopher Howard Andrews, who was the first with Wilson Smith and Patrick Laidlaw to isolate the virus in 1933. They tasked Andrews to discuss with other microbiologists in which way it was possible to create a plan, that plan, to implement that plan. It was already devised during the Third International Congress against the disease and under, of course, the WHO. Uh, in 1947 in Copenhagen, the Fourth International Congress on Microbiology was held. Andrews led this sort of informal meeting of 45 microbiologists that suggested the fact that it was necessary to create a network of laboratories whose tasks were to carry out virological studies of the antigenic variation, as I said, but also epidemiological studies and so on, and also training, and to connect these laboratories in a network under a main center that was established in Mill Hill at the National Institute for Medical Research of the Medical Research Council in London, and later also well, at the beginning in Montgomery, in New York, then in Montgomery, and then in Atlanta in the United States. So after the establishment of the first main center that was called the World Influenza Center in London in 1947, another center was added for the Americas in 1948, 1949, and officially established in 1952 to control and to be the reference center for the Americas when we talk about virological studies on influenza. That was the network. And that was the network on which preparedness was relied on. We can see on the left a map. Well, the Melbourne, if I remember well, center is covered by the other map. I'm sorry about that. I didn't notice that just now. But we have an example, a map of the centers established until by 1953, and also a map of the telegraphic sharing, the telegraphic, I would say, path or a highway in a way of information regarding not only influenza, but in this case, influenza. So we can see all these centers, they carried out these virological studies and they shared the information, centralizing it in London or Washington, or sorry, or in Atlanta or in the US. And it was, and it is still today, the system that on which we rely to prevent, to control a possible threat of influenza pandemic. Okay. Again, there were important developments during those years, during those decades, especially during the 50s and the 60s, about surveillance. Um, I've told you that when we talk about preparedness, we talk about this state of readiness, the capacity, the ability of identifying quickly a possible outbreak, and of course, after the isolation of the virus, also the antigenic configuration of the virus to control the spread of the disease, and with vaccines also to counter the spread of the disease, prompting in a way an immunization, okay, among people, the immunization among people. But also this kind of surveillance evolved during those years. In fact, at the time, surveillance was still considered something individual in a way, was considered a sort, well, was rooted in the idea of quarantine, was rooted in the idea of clinical manifestations of a disease, and quarantine or social distancing from the sick people. Okay, something changed during those years, especially thanks to the advancements, the developments, also in technological instruments. And this changed the idea of surveillance. Surveillance was not anymore something related to individual case, but was something related to collecting those epidemiological data, as already the League of Nations did, but in a way, I would say more conscient, something like that, in a way more detailed, in a way that was described by one of the most important epidemiologists at the time in the way you can read here. This is his idea of people surveillance. Surveillance, when applied to a disease, means the continued watchfulness, something that can be considered similar to the preparedness, as I've already described. Continued watchfulness over the distribution and trends of incidents through the systematic collection, consolidation, evaluation of morbidity, mortality reports, and so on and so on and so on. Of course, in this concept, also the ecological dimensions. We know that we now know that influenza is a zoonotic disease. Was implemented, especially from 1966 on, thanks to a Czech epidemiologist and virologist, Karel Raska. He was also one of the main officers of WHO at the time. And of course, influenza helped in evolving this concept in a way that was not maybe the best. Well, it was an ill way. It was thanks to pandemics. Of course, the 1957 pandemic, the Asian flu, and later 1968, the Hong Kong flu, became the terrain on which this new idea of surveillance was tested, and was tested the capacity of this epidemiological surveillance to follow the spread of the disease, and the system was tested also on the issue of creating vaccines, of manufacturing vaccines. Here again, I decided to present you these two images that connect the issue of influenza and the issue of surveillance to this, I would call it war framework, or international framework of competition. The Asian flu in 1957 was considered a sort of well, it was a disease coming from China, from mainland China, so from a communist country, and it was depicted as a problem coming from communists in a way. And again, in 1968, the Hong Kong flu, that was described as a Hong Kong flu, but it was clear that it was coming from the mainland China again, was even described as an American. So again, I wanted to highlight the fact that this kind of preparedness was rooted in military, in a way, in a military framework. And still today, when we talk about preparedness, is something that can be used for diseases as well as for war menaces. At the end of the 60s, there was a big change because recombination and molecular biology made possible to recombine viruses, strains, and create what, for instance, Edwin Kilburn, another important microbiologist, called a sort of a library of recombinants. It enhanced deeply, widely the capacity of creating proper vaccines, and it prompted the idea that at the time vaccine was the main and maybe the only way to counter the spread of the disease. Here we can see, I know that I need to go quickly, so I'll make it quick on the international health regulations. There was a revision of these regulations. They are the I've told you about the convention signed during international sanitary conferences about quarantinable diseases. They are the most updated version of those conventions. And still at the time, I just wanted to highlight the fact that influenza was not considered as a quarantinable disease, but it was necessary to notify its spread, its emergence, its spread, cases, and so on. But the
Giacomo,
real,
yes, 5 minutes, huh?
yeah, perfect. The real turning point was the new capacity in a way of microbiology to create vaccines and to modify the molecular configuration of strains to create a proper vaccine. That's why during the 70s there was a big leap forward of studies on vaccines, and also, especially from countries who had the logistics and the facilities to produce a lot of vaccines, okay, a lot of doses. There was this leap forward of studies on vaccination and also on its use as a countermeasure to the disease. It's interesting to see that until that time, uh, it was considered still unfeasible to prevent, to immunize all people against the disease. Something began to change during those years. Okay. I'll be very quick on that. I just wanted to mention the fact that something changed not only on influenza governance, but also on the health governance as a whole, especially because there was this kind of confrontation between two different perspectives on, I would say, health services uh, in a sort of a basic health services called primary health care and vertical programs, especially those based on vaccination programs. And I would say, sadly, the first approach lost its battle on against the second, and it enhanced again the idea that vertical programs based on immunization campaigns was the main and only possibility to counter pandemics. Something important changed finally also in the influenza system, because the GISN, the Global Influenza Surveillance Network, as it was conceived in 1947, was specifically a sort of a research network. They had to carry out virological studies, epidemiological studies, and so on. Later, it became more a sort of an ancillary system to manufacturers. They had to identify the most suitable strains to be included in new vaccines. As I said, to devise, to imagine, to establish immunization campaigns. Again, um, developments during the 80s were pivotal, but I don't have time because I lost it in the previous slides, so I'll be very quick on that. Molecular biology make it feasible to cut viruses to its to their own molecules and to share molecules to produce serological tests and so on. So um, until the 80s, diplomacy, well, the sharing of information and strains was pretty easy, free. Something changed at the time because it was possible to patent molecular sequences to exploit them for profits and so on. So a lot changed at the time. I just want to point out the fact that from the 80s on, the framework I've presented to you changed a lot. So it should be studied with different um instruments, or at least with a different point of view. There's a whole new diplomacy about that. It's a diplomacy that relies a lot on the sharing well, on informatics, on computers, the possibility of sharing informations and so on. But as I said, I don't have time. I just want to close on these two slides about the fact that this preparedness still had a sort of had its roots in military interest. During the in 2003, there was even a NATO workshop held in Russia. That's something interesting because we know all about the conflict now. But there was this kind of workshop held by NATO in 2003 in Russia on influenza pandemic preparedness through civil-military cooperation. And on the other hand, there was also this plan to increase vaccine supply. As I said, vaccines became the main weapon, just to stay with this narrative of military interest in influenza pandemics, the main weapon against the spread of the disease. Last thing, I swear, the last thing is the fact that this system had a lot of, was flowed with deep inequalities. In 2006, Indonesia decided not to share a strain, an avian strain that was important for the surveillance, as I said, because they, well, in a few years before Indonesia shared a strain, the WHO gave it to an Australian company. It created a vaccine, but Indonesia did not receive any doses. So these kind of inequalities were faced in the reshaping of surveillance in this pandemic influenza preparedness framework that had to create a framework in which the sharing of strains and information was counterbalanced in a way with the sharing also of doses of vaccines to prevent, to immunize people. And today, I will talk just about the image on the left. And today we have this new pandemic influenza risk management that is based on the all hazards approach management, a flexible way of suggesting ways to countries, to public authorities on how to deal with a possible outbreak of a pandemic. It's something new, and I don't have time to discuss it now. It's something interesting, but well, maybe we can talk about it during the discussion. As I said, I don't have time. Conclusion, I'll read it quickly. So the concept of preparedness is strongly influenced by two underlying ideas. The first is that pathogens are enemies, as in a war. Indeed, the interest in developing services that structurally and over time reduce the risk of disease is marginal. The second concerns the social organization embedded in biomedical science. Once again, it is needed to develop a governance that is aware of the non-neutral nature of science and aims at reducing inequalities, as the pandemic, the PEEP framework in 2011 tried to, not at cementing them. So, I hope it was at least clear in a way. I don't know. I hope it was interesting. And thank you again. And I'm here for all your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Giacomo. And was very interesting talk. You put a lot of things all together, so it's actually it was massive talk, massive amount of things because you really covered a long span and a lot of topics. So, is there anybody with questions or comments, or shall I start? Nobody, so okay, I'll go. I just wonder one thing, whether during your research you and in this history, what is the role of the, I would say, military industrial complex that is in the governance of this phenomenon. Does industry or does the military at some point become active actors, or are they just there, receiving the benefits of this of the influenza preparedness or vaccine research or these things, or are they actually active
Well,
actors in this history?
yeah, well, they were very active, especially, of course, during the Second World War is the maybe the main case, and it is in a way easy to follow the sources here. For instance, the International Health Division of the Rockefeller was deeply involved in military efforts during the Second World War, and there was also a commission on influenza created by the U.S. Army in 1941, and they asked the International Health Division to produce doses for the military preparing for the war, and they also asked for not, well, yeah, for not providing vaccines to or knowledge to enemies. It was, of course, the 1941. So even though the US, for instance, in this case, well, became not active. Well, they entered the war at the end of the at the end of the year. Of course, Washington was helping, for instance, London, the United Kingdom. So they were part of the Allies already. So yeah, it was sure that they wanted, well, they were deeply involved in research, manufacturing, and so on. There's also another case that I think it's interesting. It's more related to biowarfare in general. Influenza was not considered a possible pathogen for biowarfare, even after they understood the etiology, because they thought that, well, for instance, Italy used influenza against France. Influenza will spread also to Italy because there's no way to quarantine it. There is no way to prevent its spread. So Italy should have immunized all people to prevent the spread, and it was considered not feasible. So until the 1950s and so on, influenza was not considered as part of this biowarfare framework. It was considered just as a civil, in a way, problem, just indirectly to related to military, because of course a soldier with a fever that sneezes cannot combat. Okay, but it wasn't something related to chemicals or something like that.
Okay, thank you very much. But the flu virus was not considered a bioweapon, even in the 80s or the 90s, or at some point it became considered a bioweapon.
Well, I haven't
After
found.
genetic modification became possible, actually.
Yeah. Well, I haven't found something about that, to be honest. The interest was still more pending to the public health than to the military, in a way. Um, but I must admit that I should deepen my research there because I've just see few sources about that, about the 80s, not about the 90s. And of course, the new diplomacy of the 90s changed everything. Um, just to give you an example, the as I said, COVID is a different virus, is a coronavirus, as we know. Influenza viruses are orthomyxiviridae, are different viruses, but well, the process behind them is similar. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, all the German tests, diagnostic tests, were created using just information granted through informatical sequences of the virus. So I think that today, and I don't know because, as I said, I haven't checked the sources, and I think maybe there are no sources yet about that. I don't know. But maybe there are a new kind of military interests regarding these sequences because they can be used even without having materially the strain, so they can be used in maybe in some ways to promote a sort of biowarfare. But as I said, I'm not sure about that. Until the 80s, and I would say until the end of the 80s, yes, influenza was not considered something feasible for biowarfare, just something that was needed to be controlled for public health aims, goals, and so on.
Okay, thank you. So, any comment from the public?
So Daniele has a question, I think.
Yes, Giacomo, thank you. I hope I can ask the question before someone start crying. Well, thank you very much for your very interesting talk and very broad talk and very broad picture. I have a couple of questions. The first one concerns the interest of the Germans after the First World War in the late 1920s. Do you think that this was connected to their general attempt of maintaining, well, of acquiring position in international cooperation at the moment in which they were trying to regain their colonies? This is what we can find in other negotiations where they try to, for instance, show to the French that they are much better in contrasting health issues in Africa, and so looking for vaccines and drugs, above all against sleeping sickness and other diseases. The second one is about your idea that preparedness is in itself a military concept. I have some doubts about that. Above all, because in my view, it is in at the beginning of the 1970s when Nixon declared war on cancer that returned the metaphor, the bellic metaphor in medicine. Um, and this is connected to the climate of the Vietnam War. Because if we think to in the flu epidemics of the late 1960s, that was even in Italy defined as the special flu. So there was no, in the public opinion, it was also a strange overlooking of these epidemics that actually killed people. So it was also depicted as It's a funny thing, basically. So there was not so I haven't found a very important military metaphor until the beginning of the 1970s, the same metaphor that we find during the Age of Empire. So where microbes are depicted as the enemy, and that was mostly connected with the big contrast between France and Germany, Pasteur and Koch. But anyway, uh, very great talk.
Thank you. Well, about the first question, I'm not sure about that because I've checked sources, the League of Nations sources that help me of depicting this idea that Germany used that epidemic at the end of the 1926 to give the opportunity of the League of Nations of using the Neuen Station to promote its international role, to be engaged in this new multilateral framework, to gain legitimacy. We should know that Germany joined the League of Nations in September 1926, and they offered the use of the station in December, if I'm not mistaken. And so they leveraged, in a way, influenza to promote this role. I know nothing about the colonies, so maybe it's something that I should work on because, because yes, because it could be interesting about that. Um, about the second question or critique, um, I would say that, well, not just me. For instance, um, sorry, I can't remember the name right now. He's very famous, so it's something bad. I can remember the name right now. I'll get to it. Well, there are studies on zoonotic diseases and especially studies on the role of Macfarlane Barnett, who was an important virologist, an Australian virologist, who was involved first in the Australian Army in the 40s and later also um, in the US, not army but military system. Also, Alexander Langmuir, I mentioned for the for the development of surveillance concept during the 60s. They were all involved in military planning. They were military. Well, they were part of the military. So maybe you're right when you say that there was no metaphor about the war specifically. Uh, but I would argue that all this framework was in a way influenced by the the lines of the military, the interest of the military, also the concept itself of surveillance was, in my opinion, devised by these issues. And I'll check the name because, as I said, it's very famous. There's an article about the studies on um, a rabbit disease during Cold War, in which he describes how the military, or at least he says that they were involved in the military and the military influenced a lot their idea of surveillance. And as I said, uh, it was the same case with Langmuir. But again, um, I should work on it because maybe it's not right. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I'll check the name.
I have a
Lavinia.
question. Yes, thank you. So thank you so much for this very enlightening presentation. I know nothing about that because I am an early modernist, so I apologize if my observations and remarks are going to be completely banal. I was just I wanted to ask something. It's a bit related to what Daniele asked in terms of area of examination and inquiry, because I wanted to ask you about decolonization. So
Okay.
recently, I've been reading Amartya Sen on the question of entitlement and access theory. In Amartya Sen, problematic, it's about food. But I was wondering whether you found in your research, you mentioned the question of access to vaccine, a similar kind of analysis and questioning about these practices and also like products that permits and allow societies to be ready. And I wanted to ask you about, like how in the process of decolonization these emerges, because of course, like countries that, suffer from hunger, suffer from like climatic calamities, they are less ready to respond to these kind of questions because the immune system is weakened. So I was wondering whether you found this sort of kind of debates about decolonization and like vaccine and influenza prevention. Thank you.
Yeah. Well. Um, yes, there were a lot of mentions about this issue, but it became very evident in the 1970s and especially during the swine flu in the US. Uh, George Denner have reconstructed it. It's not my work, okay, but he noted the fact that during the WHO meeting about the swine flu in 1976, for instance, um, there was these different opinions about the possibility of vaccination against the flu. Because, for instance, the US decided to implement a mass vaccination campaign uh, throughout the country, but the OMS, the WHO officials said, well, you can do it. I'm simplifying, but that's the meaning. You can do it because you are the US, but all the world cannot do it. So we have to devise an approach regarding also immunization that can maybe make it feasible well, can let all the countries access a little bit of these doses to at least imagine a sort of campaign to protect at least the elderly or the youngest people, the younger people of the population. Well, it depends. It's not, as I said, um, of course, it depends on antibodies, the antigenic variation, because of course it depends on the immunization capacity of everybody. Okay, so it's not like it's not just statistics. It's merging statistics and virology to understand who to vaccinate. Okay, but yeah, they discussed it. And the WHO took the part in a way of developing countries about that because they said this kind of approach is not feasible for everybody. We need to create this multilateral framework that everybody can legitimate. And the US was not doing that. So they discussed it, and it was a turning point, in my opinion. That's also the point from which I decided to discuss about the molecular strategies, all this stuff, because of course it was deeply connected to the facilities, to the laboratories, to the knowledge that somebody had and somebody hadn't. So yeah, it is very important this kind of inequalities connected to decolonization and so on. But well, again, I studied also other things about colonization. Especially, I tried to focus on South Africa, and there are interesting way of uh, merging, connecting issues regarding colonization, decolonization, the role of South Africa in this case, also because South Africa was was suspended by the WHO, but still cooperated with WHO on influenza because of apartheid, of course. So I would say it's not so linear, okay, just developing countries and advanced countries. But yes, the debate was clear in the sources at the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? We are in the end of our time, actually, so maybe.
I have a question, a quick one, hopefully. Can I speak?
Yes. Ah, okay, Dario. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Thank you, Giacomo, for your presentation. I was quite interested in one of the slides that you shown earlier on about the Hong Kong flu and the fact that preparedness seemed to be tied to the pharmaceutical manufacturers. And that made me think about how whether the concept and the practice of preparedness is linked to the commodification of health. Once you consider health as a commodity, then certain political decisions depend on trade and the generation of profit. And I remember reading an example from a book on malaria by Snowden, where he says that at some point after World War II, it was preferable to spray houses with DDT rather than, doing other environmental protection. So I wonder whether in your research you have encountered, I'm sure you have encountered cases where, commodification of health had kind of some importance in the way in which health was internationalized and globalized.
Yeah, of course. I would say that since the end of the Second World War, there was commodification to a certain extent, because of course the idea of these vertical programs, as I called them, it was also relied on the fact that technology and knowledge was centralized in advanced countries, or well, maybe it was also shared, but there was no possibility of, promoting the creation of supply chains in developing countries. Okay. So it was also a means to create a market, for instance, for pharmaceuticals, of US pharmaceuticals, for instance, in worldwide. But for influenza, I would say that this commodification was was evident from the 1980s on, thanks to, as I said, the molecular developments, the idea of patenting. There was also an important lawsuit in 1980, if I remember well, in the US about the possibility of patenting genetic sequences, and so it became something. Well, influenza became then actually a commodity. Of course, vaccines are commodities, so but I'm trying to separate the idea of just creating a vaccine and selling it, and the idea of transforming the disease itself, the virus itself, in a commodity. I'm not sure if it was clear that selling and using the opportunity of selling because of influenza surveillance and immunization campaigns on one end, and it was of course something that was possible also in 1950. Okay. Influenza became itself, the virus became itself a sort of a commodity in 1980, and as I said, it changed a lot the framework of sharing information and strains about that. But yeah, it was, it was a commodity. Yeah, yeah. And the name was Warwick Anderson, of course. Warwick Anderson wrote about the fact that McFarlane Barnett and a lot of the biologists of the time were involved in military, and that it influenced a lot their idea of surveillance and also, of course, preparedness. But as I said, mm, something on which I should work. Yeah.
Ok.
Thank you.
Vedo... Parlo in italiano perché siamo rimasti solo noi, quindi credo che si possa anche switchare la lingua. Senti Giacomo, l'ultima cosa, come hai visto cambiare le statistiche nel corso del tempo, o se le hai viste cambiare? Nel senso, per esempio, le statistiche sull'influenza, cioè sulla spagnola e poi sulle varie altre epidemie sono cambiate nel corso del tempo seguendo i cambiamenti nel concetto di sorveglianza oppure, oppure no? Cioè, nel senso,
Ah.
si è visto qualcosa da questo punto di vista?
Allora, è cambiato chiaramente molto, nel senso che un grande problema della raccolta di dati sull'influenza, che appunto statistiche, io ho detto prima anche che bisogna stare attenti perché statistica non è epidemiologia, anche se chiaramente nell'epidemiologia c'è molta statistica, eccetera. Però io lo chiamo statistica in generale proprio perché in realtà la sorveglianza dell'influenza si è sempre molto basata sulla raccolta di informazioni su quelle che vengono chiamate le ILI, le Influenza-like illnesses, cioè il fatto che siccome l'influenza ha queste caratteristiche per cui è difficile distinguerla sul lato delle manifestazioni cliniche, magari anche da altri tipi di malattie, e qui sto parlando della differenza, per esempio, come dicevamo prima, tra il fatto che mi dà la febbre, la tosse e starnutisco, l'influenza come me lo può dare il Covid, ok? Allora la sorveglianza è sempre molto basata su questo largo range di statistiche per poi tentare, insomma, una verifica in laboratorio. Chiaramente le statistiche sono cambiate per precisione, per capacità descrittiva, eccetera. Se noi parliamo della spagnola o di anni, insomma, 20, 30, eccetera, le statistiche erano, ma cioè, per ammissione stessa delle fonti che mi è capitato di leggere della League of Nations, erano, cioè, inaffidabili completamente, cioè non davano un'idea né precisamente di che malattia fosse, ma non erano in grado nemmeno di dare un'idea di tutti i casi che c'erano nel paese, anche quando, per esempio, la notifica della malattia all'interno del paese era obbligatoria, perché tante volte non lo notificavano, perché come magari capita anche a noi oggi, hai la febbre, chiami il dottore, gli chiedi il permesso per stare a casa un giorno, ma non è che il dottore notifica questa cosa all'autorità pubblica, cioè mi ha chiamato Giacomo Simoncelli, eccetera. Chiaramente nel corso del tempo queste cose sono diventate molto più dettagliate, si è spinto molto per una raccolta più a tappeto delle informazioni e ci ho scritto un articolo su questo che se tutto va bene esce a maggio o giugno su una collana di Springer riguardo proprio il fatto di come l'evoluzione della sorveglianza si sia, diciamo così, incontrata con la necessità di una classificazione e di una raccolta statistica sull'influenza più adeguata al pericolo di una possibile pandemia, insomma. Chiaramente questa cosa ha avuto molto a che fare anche con, e poi chiudo, ha avuto molto a che fare anche con appunto la classificazione e il modo in cui veniva identificata l'influenza, cioè nell'International Classification of Diseases, questa grande lista, eccetera, fondamentale, costruita già alla fine dell'Ottocento e poi presa in carica dall'OMS, c'è un dibattito che va avanti per 20-30 anni sostanzialmente se la malattia debba essere classificata secondo le manifestazioni cliniche e quindi quei influenza-like illnesses, cioè quei sintomi, insomma, o debba essere classificata sulla verifica eziologica in laboratorio. E io, a mio avviso, argomento in questo articolo il fatto che anche se non ho mai trovato una fonte che lo dicesse esplicitamente, le connessioni che sono evidenti dalle fonti e anche diciamo così, la richiesta di suggestioni da parte della Division of Communicable Diseases dell'OMS, da parte di chi doveva rivedere questo tipo di classificazione riguardo ai principi della classificazione abbia spinto a mantenere una classificazione anatomica proprio per garantire la possibilità di promuovere questa sorveglianza che appunto non poteva essere effettuata semplicemente sulle verifiche di laboratorio, ma doveva prima basarsi su questa influenza-like illnesses e poi verificare in laboratorio la presenza insomma, del virus o meno o di altri para-influenza viruses o coronaviruses and so on, sì, insomma, e così via, ecco. L'ultimo appunto su questo anche nella documentazione dell'OMS fino al 75, all'80, quando tra l'altro ormai l'International Classification of Diseases prevede una differenziazione tra classificazione anatomica ed eziologica, eppure ancora la sorveglianza e le mappe stesse che si trovano nella documentazione dell'OMS diciamo, costruiscono queste mappe con, diciamo, indicando non solo la presenza di influenza, ma anche di queste influenza-like illnesses. Questo per me è un indicatore molto importante per capire che c'era una motivazione fondamentale di necessità di sorveglianza per cui era necessario mantenere una notifica e una classificazione della malattia secondo questi principi anatomici piuttosto che quelli esclusivamente eziologici.
Ok. Grazie mille dunque, e saluto tutti coloro che hanno avuto anche la pazienza di rimanere fino alla fine. E grazie mille, vi ricordo a voi pochi, ma l'avevo già detto prima, che appunto il prossimo incontro ci sarà il 5 maggio con Brenna McWhorter che appunto parlerà di astrologia e scienza alla corte di Gonzaga a partire da una serie di affreschi presenti a Palazzo Te e a Mantova e quindi grazie mille Giacomo per la discussione e il seminario, grazie mille a tutti voi per essere venuti e alla prossima.
Grazie mille a
Ciao.
tutti.
Ciao a
Ciao,
tutti, grazie
grazie
mille.
Ciao,
Giacomo. Ciao.
Ciao,
Amore,
Ciao a
ciao.
amore
tutti.
finito, amore
Ciao a
finito.
tutti.
ciao ciao.
Ecco qui, ecco qui.
Giacomo, ti chiamo tra poco.
Ciao, a presto.
Ciao.